It was the middle of our spring break, and my friends and I were going insane from boredom. Our flight to Miami had been canceled at the last minute, and we knew we'd be stuck at home for a while longer. We were just a group of restless teenagers, craving adventure. We knew this would lead to a series of dumb decisions, but hey, we were young, and that's what you do. I was mindlessly scrolling through TikTok when I came across a viral video on my For You page. The creator was part of a series about legendary haunted places across America, and this particular legend originated from San Jose, California, the closest big city to us. The TikTok described a story about a so-called tribe of albino, ghost-like figures that appeared at night, hunting unsuspecting travelers. They were rumored to practice demonic rituals, and some people even blamed them for mysterious disappearances in the mountains they supposedly inhabited. According to the legend, these creatures, known as the blood albinos, were either cursed beings or demons from another plane of existence. Other online posts mentioned hearing inhuman shrieks when driving through the area after sunset. I even found a news article from a fairly credible source about a young man who had vanished in those same hills. He was an experienced hiker, strong and healthy, with no reason to disappear. To this day, the police still hadn't found his body. After some more digging, I concluded that the blood albinos were probably just a weird cult or a group of drug dealers hiding in the hills. The hiker's disappearance could have been a coincidence. Urban legends spread so easily online that I dismissed it as just another dumb internet myth. I told my 3 friends about it, and we all laughed. None of us believed in ghosts, demons, or anything paranormal, so it was funny that we were even talking about this. But at the same time, we were all eager for an adventure. We were beyond bored, and we were intrigued by how close this legend was to us. The so-called Cursed Mountains were only about 10 minutes away. We had too much free time, and we wanted to prove that there were no blood albinos up there, that it was just a regular hill. Worst case, we figured we'd at least find a decent smoking spot. The area looked remote enough that there wouldn't be any cops around. With nothing better to do, we headed out at around 2 a.m. It was me, my friends Ryan, Marcus, and Luis. We brought flashlights, phone chargers, and some recreational supplies. We set our GPS to Hicks Road in San Jose, California, and drove off. At first, everything seemed normal. Twisting mountain roads, nothing too out of the ordinary. As we passed a reservoir, we let our guard down completely. We even started joking about how ridiculous this whole idea was and how people were scared of everything. Then Marcus found a Google Maps link on some forum that led to a specific set of coordinates, where the blood albinos were supposedly spotted. Screw it, we thought. Let's go. Every instinct in me screamed that this was a bad idea, but my judgment was terrible that night. When we got there, things started to feel genuinely unsettling. There was no phone signal. We were deep in the woods at 3 a.m. If we screamed for help, no one would hear us. Despite our unease, we kept going. Eventually, we reached a house with a long private driveway. No house number, no streetlights, and no blood albinos. Disappointed, but still eager to explore, we all got out of the car. Marcus and Ryan lit up a joint while Luis and I decided to check out the house. As we wandered around, we didn't find anything too unusual. Trash, graffiti, old liquor bottles, typical abandoned house stuff. There was a pentagram spray-painted on the ground, but we didn't think much of it. Anyone could have put it there, especially a bunch of teenagers like us. There were also some old sheds and structures, but again, nothing crazy. Just a long abandoned property. But then Luis and I noticed a trail behind the house. It wasn't a paved road, more like a dirt path, worn down from years of people walking up and down it. Clearly, someone used it often. We decided to follow. As we walked, we suddenly heard this horrible, piercing scream. It sounded human, but also not. The screams almost felt controlled, like someone was communicating. Whoever or whatever was making the sound sounded angry. We shined our flashlights in the direction of the noise and saw something on the ground. A deer. A mutilated deer. At first we assumed it was a mountain lion attack. There were plenty of them in these hills. But the way this deer was torn apart, it didn't make sense, and mountain lions don't scream like that. Then we looked up, and we froze. Not far from the deer, barely visible in the darkness, stood a figure. I thought it was Marcus messing with us, but when I pointed my flashlight at it, it wasn't Marcus. It was something standing on two legs, something that looked both human and not. Its skin was paper white. Its eyes looked blood red in the light. I wanted to believe it was just some crazy homeless guy or a drug addict living in the woods, but the way it moved wasn't human, and then it jumped. It leaped over the deer just as three more pale figures emerged from the darkness. Three of them immediately pounced on the deer carcass, dragging it into the shadows. But one of them just stood there, watching us. Luis and I were shaking. I like to think of myself as a calm person, but my adrenaline was surging. Then, the thing screamed, and it took a step toward us. I ran. I ran faster than I ever have in my life. We sprinted, knowing that our lives could depend on it. The screaming got louder, and we heard footsteps chasing after us. We reached Ryan and Marcus, who looked confused. "Start the car. Get us out of here," I gasped. They hesitated, but one look at our faces told them this wasn't a joke. We jumped into the car. Marcus started the engine. As we sped away, the screams behind us grew even louder. Then, suddenly, something slammed into the side of the car. Marcus barely had time to react. It hit the front bumper hard. None of us wanted to turn around and see what it was. But I glanced back and I saw it. That pale creature, standing in the middle of the road, completely unfazed, staring at us with those eerie red eyes as we drove away. By the time we made it back to the city, we were shaking. We told Ryan and Marcus everything. We debated calling the police, but we knew two things. One, we'd get in trouble for the weed in the car. Two, no cop would ever believe us. The car had a massive dent in the front bumper, but that wasn't enough to prove the blood albinos were real. We almost never talked about that night again. Luis and I briefly mentioned it once or twice, but we'd always dropped the subject right away. At first, Ryan and Marcus were skeptical, but after seeing how terrified we were, they believed us. So here's my message to anyone thinking about visiting Hicks Road in San Jose. Bring a friend and go during the day. You do not want to meet what we met that night. This incident happened around the fall of 2006. I grew up in a rural part of Ohio, where a dense forest stretched right behind my house. As a child, I had an adventurous spirit and a deep love for exploring. That forest was my sanctuary, my favorite place in the world, at least until this incident occurred. I had wandered through those woods countless times, always with my mother's permission. There was one particular tree that I loved climbing. It stood about halfway through my usual path, and I often perched myself on one of its thick branches, simply relaxing and listening to the peaceful sounds of nature. The first time I managed to climb that tree felt like a great achievement. From that vantage point, I could see part of my backyard. On that particular late October day, after a while of exploring, I carefully climbed up my favorite tree. I sat on a sturdy branch, taking in the familiar view. Because it was late autumn, the sun was inevitably starting to set within minutes. I always felt a slight sadness as darkness crept in. The forest was my little refuge, where I could entertain myself for hours. As the twilight deepened, however, I knew it was time to leave. My mother had a habit of standing at the forest's edge and calling my name until I obediently made my way home, ensuring I wouldn't be caught outside after dark. That evening, I watched the sun set until it disappeared completely. Then I began my descent from the tree. I was nearly at the base when I heard my mother's familiar voice calling my name. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was routine. But as my feet touched the ground, I noticed something strange. My mother's voice was coming from behind me, deeper within the forest instead of from the usual direction near the entrance where she always stood. My mother had never entered the woods before, at least not without me. Excited by the idea of showing her my favorite spots before it got too dark, I instinctively turned toward the sound. But then, a chilling realization struck me. How could she have gotten into the forest ahead of me? I was certain I hadn't passed her. As I hesitated, she kept calling my name, but there was something off about it. Her voice sounded frantic, almost angry, as if she were terrified that I was in trouble. For reasons I couldn't explain, I froze in place as the voice drew closer. I squinted through the dimming light, trying to locate her and gauge her emotions. But I saw no one. Nothing unusual at all. Then suddenly I heard my mother's voice again, this time coming from the direction of the house. It was much calmer. A few seconds later, the voice from the forest called my name once more. It wasn't an echo. I wasn't imagining things. I was truly hearing my mother's voice calling me from the backyard, while something else, something identical to her, was calling me from the woods in front of me. Panic surged through me. "Come here right now," the voice from the forest suddenly demanded, now much closer than before. That was all I needed to hear. I didn't question which voice was real. Something in the way the first voice spoke filled me with an indescribable dread. Terrified of what I might see if I lingered any longer, I spun around and ran as fast as I could toward the forest's exit. Strangely, despite my panic, I didn't trip over anything. Though my house wasn't far, the woods had never felt larger than in that moment. Behind me, my mother continued calling my name, now sounding desperate. My real mother was waiting at the forest's edge, patient as always, expecting me to come home. The second I stepped onto the backyard grass beside her, the voice in the woods went silent. Not faded, just stopped, instantly. I must have looked as shaken as I felt because my mother immediately asked me what was wrong. My panic gradually subsided, and I didn't say anything until we were safely inside the house with the doors locked. Then, I hesitantly asked her if she had gone into the woods. She looked genuinely confused by the question and told me, "Of course not." With that confirmation, I nervously asked if she had heard someone else calling my name or shouting. Her answer was a simple no. Though I was still unsettled, I did my best to explain everything that had happened as clearly and rationally as possible. My mother remained calm throughout, telling me that I had probably imagined it, that I had spent too much time alone in the woods. But the experience has haunted me ever since. Even now, I can still hear that voice as clearly as if it had just happened. Whoever, or whatever, was calling my name sounded exactly like my mother. But I know it wasn't her. Not just because she was waiting for me outside, but because that voice had an eerie quality to it that I still can't fully explain. I didn't return to the woods until I was 17, and even then I never stayed out too long. I've carefully considered every possible explanation, but none seem entirely reasonable. It couldn't have been my mother playing a trick. There was no way she could have pulled it off. Not to mention, she was never the type to prank me. I also highly doubt it was someone else. As I mentioned earlier, we lived in a very rural area. Our nearest neighbor was at least a mile away, and I didn't know any of them well. How would they know my name? How would they know where to find me? Since then, we've moved away from that house. Every now and then, my mother and I discuss the event, and she still insists that she never saw or heard anything unusual out there. I know I probably shouldn't dwell on it, but that night in the woods still troubles me. I had spent hours there before, and nothing unusual had ever happened, until that day. The best explanation I can come up with is some kind of doppelganger, or maybe even something more sinister, but I'm not sure. If anyone has a theory about what could have happened, I'd love to hear it. I am a 23-year-old woman who never used to believe in ghosts at all. As a psychology student, I always thought everything could be explained by anxiety and fear. That was until last year. This happened in Colorado Springs, on Gold Camp Road. If you know what I'm talking about, then you know this place is infamous for urban legends and eerie ghost stories. Gold Camp Road winds along the mountainside, with several large tunnels carved through the rock that you have to drive through to reach the end. The road is mainly used for scenic drives overlooking the city and accessing hiking trails. There are countless scary stories about this place, ones I had heard growing up in the area. One of the most well-known tales claims that a school bus full of children crashed in one of the tunnels after part of it collapsed, trapping their souls inside. Supposedly, if you drive into the tunnel at night, turn off your headlights, and sprinkle baby powder or flour on your windshield, tiny, ghostly handprints will appear. I wasn't sure if I believed that story, but I had also heard that many bodies had been dumped along the roadside. Steep cliffs and dense, isolated woods make for an ideal place to hide evidence. None of this ever meant anything to me. I used to drive along Gold Camp Road about once a week during the summer. It was the perfect nighttime drive with friends, with plenty of secluded spots to stop for a smoke, all with the reassurance that you were unlikely to run into the cops. And no, I won't be offended if you think I might have been a little high, and that played into what I saw. Anything is possible. That night, my friend, she was 21, and I spent about an hour smoking, wandering around scenic spots and listening to music until around 3 or 4 in the morning. Again, we had done this routine all summer and were used to the dark, creepy tunnels and the thick forests at night. This night didn't feel any different, at first. But as we started climbing higher up the mountain, something shifted. I'm not sure how to explain it, but it felt like we had crossed an invisible threshold. One moment it was just us in the still, quiet night. The next, it felt overwhelmingly crowded. We couldn't see anything. It was still pitch black, but it was like we had suddenly walked into a massive, noisy crowd, yet with no physical movement around us. It was just energy. I started feeling uneasy, and my friend admitted she was getting scared. I told her it was fine. We were almost at the second tunnel, and then we'd head back down. We entered the tunnel, and my headlights illuminated everything up to the other end. That's when I saw him, clear as day, a young boy standing just to the right of the tunnel, nearly pressed against the wall. But he wasn't exactly a real boy. He looked like an overexposed film photograph of a child, too bright, too washed out. My friend and I both gasped, and I slammed on the brakes. And then, suddenly, he was gone. No, I don't mean he disappeared. I mean we realized he had never been there. You know that feeling when you wake up in the middle of the night, see a coat hanging on the door, and for a split second you're convinced someone is standing there, but then your eyes adjust and you realize there was never anything there in the first place? It was like that. But there was nothing we could have mistaken for a person. The tunnel was empty, just smooth rock walls and the harsh glare of my headlights. There was no trick of the shadows, no odd formations, no objects at all. I have never seen anything like it. And what convinced me most was that my friend saw him too. Neither of us had the typical reaction of mistaking something for a ghost. like a quick jump scare or just getting the chills. I hit the brakes because I was absolutely sure there was a child standing there, and then suddenly there wasn't. It was the strangest experience of my life, and I will never doubt the existence of the paranormal again. All I can say is, don't be so quick to dismiss urban legends. They have a strange way of finding you. My boyfriend and I loaded our 2-month-old daughter into the car and drove from Miami to Naples to visit my family. As new parents, we were incredibly anxious about such a long trip with an infant, so we prepared for every possible situation. We left shortly after noon with my boyfriend behind the wheel, merging onto the busy holiday traffic on the highway. About an hour into the drive, our baby became fussy, so we pulled into a rest stop to feed her and change her diaper. While I was tending to her, my boyfriend stood outside the car stretching when he suddenly called my name. Looking out, I followed his gaze across the parking lot to see a clown standing on the other side. He had a purple star painted on his face, wild, unkempt black hair, and wore a checkered purple and white suit. He simply stood there, waving at people as they came and went from the rest stop. I chuckled and went back to what I was doing, assuming he was part of some promotional event. As we left the rest stop, the clown waved at us and I lazily waved back just as my boyfriend lifted his foot off the brake and eased the car forward. That's when the clown flashed me the hungriest, most unsettling grin I'd ever seen and shouted, "You'd look so good with me on your lap." Even through the closed car window, I heard him clearly. "Wow, what a creep," I muttered as we drove away. I repeated what he had said to my boyfriend who hadn't caught it, and for a few minutes he was determined to turn back and confront the guy. But I told him it wasn't worth it. We still had a long drive ahead. We arrived in Naples shortly after 2:30 p.m., and by then, I had completely forgotten about the incident. I didn't even mention it to my parents. We had a great time with them and ended up staying later than planned, finally leaving just before 11:30 p.m. My parents had tried to convince us to spend the night, but we hadn't packed anything for ourselves, only supplies for the baby, so we decided to drive back. We figured the roads would be less busy, making the trip faster. My boyfriend had been driving for about 45 minutes when he asked if I minded taking over because he was struggling to keep his eyes focused. I told him to pull into the next rest stop, and I'd drive. A few minutes later, we saw a rest stop sign and pulled in. But it wasn't like the one before. There were no bathrooms, no vending machines, nothing. It was just a long, empty parking lot with a row of spaces that curved around behind the road. My boyfriend pulled into a front-facing spot, so the car was positioned toward a long chain-link fence with nothing but trees and marshland beyond it. In the glow of the headlights, I couldn't see much. He shifted the car into park, left the engine running, and kept the lights on as he climbed out of the driver's seat. Almost immediately, our baby started fussing. As soon as I got out of the passenger seat and opened the back door to check on her, my boyfriend settled into the passenger seat and closed his eyes. I made sure the baby was okay. She seemed like she'd fall back asleep once we started driving again. I shut the back door and walked to the driver's side. That's when I heard it. The sound of the chain-link fence rattling and something scraping against the metal, moving closer. I turned toward the noise and for a second only saw a dark silhouette on the other side of the fence. Then, stepping into the light of our headlights, it was him, the clown from earlier. Except this time there was a huge red stain splattered across his purple and white suit. He was dragging a broken beer bottle along the fence as he grinned at me. He pressed his face against the gaps in the metal, his eyes locking onto mine as he giggled and flicked his tongue in obscene gestures. I was frozen, stunned into silence, unable to process whether I should feel terror or burst into laughter at how absurd it all was. My boyfriend jolted awake, saw my face, and immediately jumped out of his seat, yelling for me to get in the car. The baby started crying, her wails echoing through the otherwise silent parking lot. The clown immediately started singing, his voice raspy and eerie. "Rock-a-bye baby in the treetop." My boyfriend grabbed a glass souvenir my parents had given us from the front seat, a fancy, heavy piece, and threw it as hard as he could at the clown. The glass shattered against the chain-link fence, sending sharp shards flying everywhere. The clown shrieked and instantly bolted down the fence line, disappearing into the darkness. We jumped into the car, slammed the doors shut, and locked them. I threw the car into reverse, backing out of the spot as fast as I could. As I shifted into drive, we saw him again, this time sprinting toward us across the parking lot. My boyfriend shouted at me to run him over, but I swerved and sped out of the lot, my heart hammering in my chest. For the next several minutes, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting a car to come speeding up behind us, trying to force us off the road. But nothing happened. We were too shaken to do anything but keep asking each other, over and over again, what the hell had just happened? Who was that guy? What was he doing out there in the middle of the Everglades, dressed like a clown at midnight on Thanksgiving? Was he just messing with people, or did he have more sinister intentions? You'd have to be seriously brave, or seriously crazy, to pull a stunt like that in Everglades country. The people who live out there don't tolerate that kind of nonsense. And what was he doing behind that fence, lurking in the dark, just waiting for a random car to pull in so he could traumatize its occupants? I don't know if the stain on his suit was actually blood, but he made us feel threatened enough that we had reason to throw something at him. And given that his immediate reaction was to attack, I suspect his intentions weren't harmless. The fact that we had seen him earlier in the day only made the situation worse. It felt like he had been watching us, following us. My boyfriend has a concealed carry permit, and all I can say is, it's probably a good thing he wasn't carrying that night. We're staying home next Thanksgiving. When most people think of a clown, they imagine something goofy or even charming, maybe even a certain comic book villain that some find strangely attractive. But I promise you, not all clowns are like that. When I was a freshman in high school, I had a MySpace page. One evening, I received a friend request from an attractive girl. She messaged me, and after chatting for a while, she suggested we exchange nude photos. Being a naive 14-year-old, I thought, sure, this sounds amazing. So I took a few photos of myself and sent them to her. In return, she sent me some nude photos of herself. Everything seemed fine until, out of nowhere, I received a message on AM from someone I didn't know. The message basically said, "Hey, I have your nude photos. If you don't talk to me, I'll send them to everyone on your friends list." I panicked. I didn't know what to do, so I started talking to him. At first, he claimed to be a senior from my high school. He demanded that I log onto my computer every night at 9 p.m. to chat with him, or else he would share my photos. This went on for weeks, and things started to escalate. Eventually, I realized he wasn't a high school senior at all. He was an adult, a complete psychopath. One night I was at a friend's house, and the only person home was my sister. She called me and said some guy had called the house, insisting on speaking to me. He was furious when she told him I wasn't home. A few nights later, I couldn't log onto AIM until midnight. The first message he sent when I finally logged in was, "I was sitting outside your house admiring your Winnie the Pooh flag and trying to look into your bedroom window. I was terrified. My mom always decorated for the seasons, and at the time, we had some cheesy Winnie the Pooh Valentine's Day flags hanging on the front porch. By this point, I hadn't told anyone about this guy. I just hoped he would go away. But I finally woke up my brother and told him what was happening. He insisted we call the police, but I believed I could handle it myself, and that involving the police wasn't necessary. He disagreed and went to wake up our parents. I told them everything, and my mom immediately freaked out. rightfully so, and called the police. The police arrived, and I spoke with them for a while, showing them some of the messages he had sent me. They filed a report, and from that night on I completely ignored him, resigning myself to the fact that the world might see me naked. Over the next few months, I received random messages from girls sending me photos. I was mortified and scared to go to school, thinking this guy would tell everyone I had sent him photos and that I was gay, etc. At that age, things like that can really mess with you. Fast forward to my senior year of high school, and all of this had mostly faded from my mind. I had done a good job of forgetting how this guy had tormented me, and things were going well for me. But one night at a football game, as I was walking to the concession stand with a group of friends, a stranger approached me and said, "Someone wants to talk to you under the bleachers." My heart dropped, and I immediately said I didn't want to talk to anyone. Remember, this was nearly 4 years after the initial incident, but I had always feared that one day he would come looking for me. I knew it was him, even though I had never seen him before. I could just tell by the way the stranger asked. Everyone asked me what was going on, and I quickly explained who I thought it was. We all went back to the bleachers, and another friend ran up to me saying, "Hey, some creepy guy's in the bathroom, showing people your nude photos." We were sitting near one of my teachers, and as soon as he heard this, he called the police and ran to the bathroom to try to catch the guy, but he was already gone. I described him to the police, and some concerned parents had seen the car he drove off in. I didn't sleep for days after that. I was terrified this guy would come to my house to find me. I couldn't believe this creep was still after me. But after a few months, nothing else happened, and I started to forget about him. Then, one spring afternoon during my senior year, I was called into the dean's office. There were several police officers and a detective there. They told me they had caught the guy who had been harassing me. He had been doing similar things to other kids at my school for quite some time. He had previously been in prison for sexually assaulting a minor and had a long list of other crimes. The police had found gigabytes of child pornography on his computer, as well as tons of evidence of his obsession with me. After a lengthy trial, he was sentenced to prison until 2037, and I hoped he would be out of my life forever. Back in 2012, I was walking home around 9 at night in Gilbert, Arizona. I was passing through a large park with several soccer fields and basketball courts when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. The overhead lights were still on, illuminating the fields, and I noticed someone sitting cross-legged on the grass. I took off my headphones and stepped off the sidewalk for a better look. At first, I thought maybe someone had hurt themselves. But as I got a few steps closer, I saw it was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, hunched over something. It was hard to tell her exact age because her face was painted white with a red heart inside a black spade on her cheek. Her upper lip was painted black and her lower lip was a deep red. She wore a gray hoodie with the hood up, but there were 2 slits cut on either side to accommodate her blonde braids. I stopped and glanced around, thinking this had to be some kind of YouTube prank, but we were in the middle of an open area, and apart from the occasional passing car, we seemed completely alone. The girl was wearing bright red sneakers, ripped jeans, and a type of glove with claw-like extensions on her right hand, almost like Freddy Krueger's. I was only about 12 feet away, close enough to say something, but I decided to slowly back away instead, not wanting to engage with whatever she was doing. As I stepped back, she spoke without looking up. "Where are you going? Come here." "I'm good," I replied and kept walking. For the first time, she looked up and grinned, too wide, showing more teeth and gums than necessary. She raised her clawed hand, and I noticed that each fingertip had a sharp, pin-like point. Yeah, that was enough for me. Then she pulled out a large kitchen knife and started cutting into something on the ground. I glanced down and saw a dead bird beneath her, its feathers being plucked with her clawed hand. She stabbed the bird with the knife and then pulled a bottle from her pocket, taking a sip. I nearly stumbled back onto the pavement as I hurried to put distance between us. I didn't want to turn my back on her, but the whole time, I kept thinking this had to be a prank. I started looking around for someone recording with a camera or phone, but there was no one else in sight, and nowhere anyone could be hiding. I quickly turned and fast walked down the sidewalk toward my apartment complex. When I reached an intersection, I had to wait for the light to change before I could cross safely. I put my headphones back on, but honestly, I wasn't even listening to music. I was too shaken up, my mind racing over what I had just seen. Then I glanced over my shoulder and felt my stomach drop. The clown girl was walking down the sidewalk toward me, staring right at me. I yanked my headphones off again, checking both directions for cars. The light was still green for traffic, but I didn't care. I ran across the street. When I reached the other side, I turned back and saw her standing at the intersection, watching me. She waved with her clawed hand, a few stray feathers drifting to the ground. Then she called out something. Over the noise of traffic, I wasn't entirely sure, but I swear she said, "Don't get yourself killed tonight." That was it. I ran home through the gated entrance of my complex and took a long route around the building to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I got to my apartment, I locked both deadbolts and stared through the peephole, heart pounding. I stood there for 5 minutes before I finally calmed down. I didn't turn on any lights. Instead, I used my phone to navigate to my bedroom and my laptop's screen glow to change into my sleep clothes. The next morning, when the sun was high in the sky, I went back to check the spot where the clown girl had been. Sure enough, there was a dead bird lying in the grass. A few weeks later, I saw her again, this time in broad daylight. I was driving my friend's car when I noticed her walking on the sidewalk, still in full makeup, wearing the same hoodie. She was dragging a trash bag behind her. Curious, I turned onto a side street and followed at a distance, stopping here and there to let her get ahead before continuing. After about half a mile, she reached an empty lot. I watched as she pulled something out of the trash bag. It looked like a dead rat. She took out a switchblade and cut into it, squeezing it like a sponge. Blood dripped onto the ground and onto her clothes. Then she turned toward me. Blood running down her fingers, she raised her right hand and made a gesture, placing her thumb between her index and middle fingers. It was called the fig sign. If anything, it was even ruder than flipping someone off. I immediately threw the car in reverse and got the hell out of there. It wasn't her turning toward me that freaked me out. It was the fact that she somehow knew she was being followed, and even more than that, it was the gesture she used. Because that was my gesture, the one I used in traffic all the time, the one hardly anyone even knew about. The fact that she did, that sent a chill down my spine. I moved away not long after, but my friend still lives in the area. Every now and then he tells me he sees her wandering the sidewalks. So next time you're in Gilbert, keep your eyes open. I've worked at 4 different hotels, and one of my former bosses once told me that any hotel over 10 years old will have had someone die in it. The only hotels that don't are the brand new ones. So, I started asking around among my coworkers. Every hotel in my area had at least one death in the past few years, if not more. If a place has had deaths, then logically, 100% of old hotels should be haunted. In my 6 years working night shifts, I personally witnessed 2 deaths at different hotels, one suicide and another worse. My ex worked at a hotel that had a room permanently off limits, used only for storage, because it was the site of a notorious mass murder in the 1960s. Deaths in hotels aren't rare. That being said, I don't automatically assume that every death means a haunting. Out of all the hotels I've worked at, only one had anything truly unexplainable happen during my time there. I worked strict night shifts, from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. By 11 p.m., I would lock all the doors and only interact with guests through the night window. I like this setup because honestly, I don't really like people, but I'm good at playing the part of a great customer service employee. Hospitality was practically my middle name. After 11 p.m., I had to lock up the front desk area, the lobby, office, and the breakfast room, leaving me alone until morning. That was my little private kingdom, secure and isolated. A few weeks into the job, I was scrolling on my phone when the breakfast room doors suddenly slammed as if something had kicked. Then with full force, then silence. I looked at the security cameras, which were pointed directly at those doors. Nothing. I rewound the footage a few seconds. Nothing. Went back even further. Still nothing. When I watched myself on camera, flinching at the noise, it confirmed that I'd heard something real, but the doors never moved. It was the exact sound of those French doors slamming shut. No doubt about it. I walked around the office, the lobby, and the breakfast area. Checked outside. Maybe I had heard a car crash or something. Nothing. I checked the room above my office and the breakfast area. No one was there. Those were usually the last rooms to be booked, so they were often empty. Over time, the door slamming, noises became a pattern. Not just the breakfast room doors, but the lobby doors too, which I could see clearly from my spot behind the desk. It got worse when the door to the private office, the one with no sign, only used by employees, became another target of these invisible kicks. I kept a log of everything that happened during my shifts. Any issues for the next shift, guest complaints, special requests, anything unusual. I started documenting the noises and asked my coworkers if they had noticed anything weird. None of them had. Not even the other night shift workers, but they had a high turnover rate. Aside from the front desk manager and housekeeping staff, I was the longest serving employee within 6 months. The other night shift workers never lasted more than 3 months. I worked every Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, so they always got weekends off, but they never stayed long. Then the ice machine started acting up. Ice would randomly shoot out onto the breakfast room floor. This happened far less frequently than the door noises, but it still occurred multiple times in my 2 years there. As far as I knew, it never happened during anyone else's shift. The owner brushed it off as a mechanical issue and barely paid attention to my reports. He just told me to clean up when it happened and to put out a wet floor sign if it was close to breakfast hours. But then, oddly, an Indian man, started showing up at dawn more often, blessing the place. Next came the clicking sounds, like the rapid tapping of nails on a hardwood floor. If you've ever heard a dog with long nails running across wood, that was exactly it. At first I thought it might be a large rat or some other animal, but security footage and my own nightly patrols with a broom in hand found nothing. I still reported it to the owner, who called pest control just to be safe. But they found no evidence of rodents, no droppings, no gnaw marks, no activity in the traps. Yet the clicking persisted. It became another one of those regular sounds. Near the end of my time there, the strangest thing happened. One night I was on the phone with a friend, sitting in the back of my office, far from the desk. In the far left corner of the room, there was an industrial coffee maker and a small whiteboard where we tracked daily numbers. Out of nowhere, the whiteboard flew off the wall and hit me square in the face before dropping to the floor at my feet. That was weird because it had fallen before, but it had always dropped straight down onto the manager's desk, the desk I was standing 8 feet away from. There was no wind, Nothing that could have pushed it at an angle. For it to hit me in the face, it would have had to move almost perfectly horizontal. I laughed it off, but honestly, I kicked myself later for not pulling up the security footage. That was probably the strongest evidence I'd ever had of anything paranormal. But at the time, I was so distracted by other things in my life that I just shrugged it off. Looking back, I was working alone every night in a hotel where someone had died in a room just one door away from my office, and I hadn't even realized it at the time. There was a small YouTube channel called Sam's Online Food Reviews, run by my best friend Sam Ryder. The channel was filled with videos of Sam eating and reviewing food and drinks in front of the camera. It had around 10,000 subscribers. Not huge, but big enough for Sam to pour his heart into it. I can recall countless times sitting in the passenger seat of his car, just out of frame, as he decided to film himself trying something he'd picked up from a store. He'd give a thumbs up or down, followed by his catchphrase, "I like it" or "I hate it." Sam was loved for his friendly demeanor and cheerful, kind personality. His audience adored him, and hateful comments were rare. When they did appear, Sam would ignore them and keep smiling. 7 months ago, Sam's Online Food Reviews went dark without warning. No announcement, no explanation, just deactivated. I hadn't heard or seen from Sam despite countless calls and visits to his house. 6 days after his channel disappeared, I called the police for a welfare check. I was worried he'd fallen ill or hurt himself. The police broke into his house but found nothing. Sam was declared missing. A week later, a dog walker discovered a horrifically mutilated body on some train tracks. The corpse had severe lacerations around the head, arms, chest, and legs, and was nearly severed at the waist. Decomposing organs, spilled out from a gruesome V-shaped cut. The autopsy report noted that while no direct cause of death could be confirmed, a large cut to the throat was likely responsible. Other suspicious findings included the absence of the stomach and heart, long strips of flesh cut from the chest, arms, and lower back, and near total blood loss. The scene had little blood, suggesting the body had been drained elsewhere. 2 weeks later, dental records confirmed the worst. The body was Sam's. The police investigated but found no forensic evidence of anyone else at the scene. They concluded he'd been hit by a freight train, with the lacerations and organ loss attributed to being dragged and scavenged by wildlife, perhaps a fox. Sam's mother decided to cremate what remained of her only son. I stood beside her as the coffin was pushed into the furnace. When the door closed and the gas flames roared, she broke down, and so did I. I stood there sobbing for 90 minutes as the person I'd grown up with and shared so many memories with turned to ash. I mourned my friend and tried to move on. Things were going well. I got a new job and started dating a girl I met through work. Months passed, and though I missed Sam, life seemed to be improving. Then one night at 3 a.m. while browsing Reddit, I received a Facebook message from Sam's account. My heart stopped when I saw his profile picture in the message bubble, a photo from happier times, his bright smile unmistakable. A deep, chilling fear gripped me, the kind that freezes your limbs and makes your heart race as adrenaline floods your body. I opened the message. It contained a link to a file sharing site. The URL a random string of numbers and letters. My heart pounded. What was on the other side of that link? And more importantly, why was my dead friend sending it to me? My hands moved on autopilot, hovering over the link. A voice in my head screamed not to click, but I did it anyway. I immediately regretted it. Chrome opened a new tab to the site. The screen was gray except for a black rectangle in the center with a play button. I stared at it, terrified of what I was about to see. About 10 seconds later, the screen refreshed, and instead of the play button, a countdown appeared. Autoplay. In 5 seconds. I watched the numbers tick down, trying to make sense of what was happening. A sudden buzzing noise made me jump as the video began to play. The camera focused on what looked like a dirty, white-tiled surface. Muffled groans and footsteps grew, louder as someone approached the camera. There was a slight rustling as the camera adjusted, blurring briefly before refocusing. My breath caught in my throat. In the center of a white-tiled room, Sam lay on his back on a stainless steel table. His eyes were wide open, clear and unfiltered, filled with terror. Sweat glistened on his forehead under the light of a single bulb hanging above. His bare chest heaved rapidly in panic as he stared into the camera, trying to scream through a tight cloth gag. His hands were bound with duct tape. I stared at the screen, feeling increasingly nauseous, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. Before I could comprehend it, Sam's muffled cries were interrupted by a high-pitched, mocking voice. "Welcome to Sam's Online Food Reviews. Today we have a special treat." Sam's panic intensified as he struggled against his restraints. The voice continued. "Today we'll be trying something considered a delicacy in many countries, though often banned." The camera zoomed out slightly, revealing a man standing in front of Sam. He wore a white coat with a red striped apron, a butcher's hat, a cloth mask, and rubber gloves. In one hand he held a large red-handled knife, in the other a sharpening steel. The man began sliding the knife along the steel, the sound of metal on metal filling the room. Sam's muffled screams grew more desperate. The man set the sharpening steel down and walked around the table. Sam turned his head, pleading with the man in what sounded like a desperate, incoherent babble. "Poor little lamb," the man said. "It won't hurt for long and you'll taste delicious." Tears streamed down my friend's face as he thrashed. The man flipped Sam onto his stomach and pulled his head over the edge of the table. He stepped out of the room briefly, returning with a metal bucket which he placed beneath Sam's head. In one swift motion, the man grabbed a fistful of Sam's hair, tilted his head back, and slit his throat. Bright red blood gushed out, splattering, into the bucket and onto the floor. Sam's body convulsed uncontrollably as blood spurted from his neck like a volcanic eruption. I vomited, horrified, and fell out of my chair. I crawled away, unable to watch any longer. The speakers on my computer were loud enough to hear the sounds of cutting and gurgling. I curled up in a corner, sobbing in panic. When the sounds finally stopped, I tremblingly stood up and approached my computer, avoiding the puddle of vomit on the floor. I forced myself to look at the screen. The page had closed and Chrome showed the Reddit tab. On Facebook, there was a notification. I didn't want to click it, but I told myself it was another message from Sam. First, to start, I think I should explain to some readers the difference between the deep web and the dark web. The deep web is a place that can be accessed online using special web browsers like Tor, containing illegal things such as drugs, human trafficking, and hired assassins. The dark web, on the other hand, consists mostly of things that are no longer accessible by conventional means, such as military websites and other sites that haven't been integrated into the current internet architecture. With that in mind, I want to share with all of you the story of my accidental journey into the unknown space called the dark web. I am a professional computer technician. I work for a company contracted by local businesses and individual consumers to set up internet connections, install software, and fix any computer issues that may arise. Because of that, I hear all sorts of crazy stories and problems that people come up with. I swear some of them don't even know how to use a computer, even in this day and age. One day I received a call from a local business complaining that their internet wasn't working properly and that they might have a virus. I shook my head, thinking that maybe someone had unplugged the network cable or accidentally downloaded a Trojan. As soon as I arrived, the man who had called immediately recognized me and started rambling about hackers, how much he hated Microsoft Windows, and how many viruses it created, all the nonsense I usually get when dealing with business issues. He led me to his computer, and I took out my laptop, sat down, and started working. He wished me luck and walked away to do whatever he did in his free time. I opened the browser he used, and unsurprisingly, it opened to a blank page. He didn't even have a homepage set up. At this point, I tried connecting to google.com and got a 404 error. Alright, I knew for a fact that google.com existed, so something was definitely wrong with this connection. I opened his network and sharing center to see if I could use the built-in troubleshooter to diagnose the issue, but I mentally slapped myself when I saw that he wasn't connected to any network at all. I searched for available networks and found a few wireless connections he could join. All of them were WEP encrypted, and I was almost certain he didn't know the key. So, I pulled out my laptop and ran a WEP cracking tool while rebooting his computer. As I was waiting for my tool to crack the WEP key, suddenly another network appeared on my laptop. This one was unsecured, with an SSID consisting of a random hexadecimal string. Now, I was extremely bored waiting for this guy to return, so I decided to connect to the network and look around to see where it came from. I connected without any issues and opened my toolkit to see if I could trace the source of this connection. As I was happily poking around in this unprotected network, my computer froze. It only lasted for a second or two, but this didn't happen often, and it caught me off guard. I dismissed it as slow internet and continued. A few minutes later it happened again. Then a few minutes after that it happened yet again, each time lasting longer than before. Strange. I wondered what was up with this network. That's when things started getting really interesting. After a long series of freezes, my screen flickered slightly, and suddenly my browser opened by itself. Now, I was worried that I had somehow infected my computer with some type of malware by connecting to this network. I proceeded to close the browser and disconnect from the network before anything worse could happen. But I couldn't disconnect. No matter how many times I clicked the small disconnect button, my computer didn't respond, even though everything else on my screen was running fine. Shit, I thought to myself. This was going to be a long day. Just as I was about to press the power button on my laptop to do a hard reset, my browser opened again. This time, a small chat box popped up. Hello. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, unsure of what was happening. I want to talk to you right now. I had heard about AI programs with pre-scripted responses designed to simulate conversations with people, and I wasn't impressed. This is a dangerous virus. You need to leave this network right now. This is your final warning. Maybe an automated security program designed to deter hackers? I had to admit, I was impressed. I had never seen anything like this before. This is your last chance. Stay away. I don't know what made me do it, but I responded. The next response scared me more than anything in the world. The program started listing information about me, my name, my address, my phone number, my credit card information, my parents' names, their address. My heart sank and all the color drained from my face. I couldn't move. I just sat there, paralyzed with fear. But what happened next was even worse. Don't look at me like that. My webcam was on. You really shouldn't stare, username. You might see something you suddenly regret. The most horrifying images I could imagine appeared on my screen. Images of people being gutted, human sacrifices, severed limbs, cannibals eating human flesh. Footage of mass suicides and gun executions. My heart pounded wildly. My body trembled in fear. The images burned into my brain, things no one should ever have to see. I gathered all the strength I had left and slammed the power button on my laptop, shutting it off immediately. I ran to the bathroom and vomited multiple times. I was drenched in sweat. I could barely calm myself down. It took me about 20 minutes to return to my computer, and even then, I struggled to approach it. I looked over at the client's computer and saw that it was now connected to the wireless network I had cracked earlier. It was working fine. Right at that moment, my client returned and thanked me for fixing his internet. I didn't say a word. I just grabbed my laptop and left.